everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 153 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we're not talking about Andre 3 stacks. In fact, we're only going to talk about one because we're going to talk about the stack. Yes, folks, if your tuck sucks, this is the one you want to listen to. If you fail at the exhale, this is the one you want to listen to. If your inhale is stale, this is the one you want to listen to. If you want to talk to Zach, then you best learn how to stack. Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Jim. And here's what Jim asks. With normal breathing, it appears we should get expansion of all the ribs. But yet, with the stack, it appears as though you should not allow the ribs to flare out. So, in a sense, with the stack, do we not want expansion of the ribs? Well, Jim, we actually do want expansion of the ribs. It's just a matter of where and actually what is going on when you see ribs flaring. So let's dive into that. When you do the stack, or why are we stacking? That's probably a good first question. The reason why we're stacking is because we want to restore respiratory mechanics so we can promote expansion in all directions of the body, especially with the ventral cavity. When you take a breath of air in and your diaphragm descends, it shoots the viscera downward. The pelvic floor has to descend posteriorly in particular to make that happen. And so when that happens, you get the ab wall expanding in all directions. You get the pelvic floor and the pelvis. Grab my grandson. You get the pelvis expanding in all directions, and your body just has to get bigger to increase the available space to make room for the air that's coming in. Now at the rib cage, what we want to see is very similar things. I want to see the rib cage expand laterally. I want to see it expand front to back. That's the pump handle and posterior expansion. The lateral expansion is the bucket handle. You're going to see slight elevation of the rib cage. And the reason why I say slight is because, folks, the scalenes are a primary muscle of inspiration. So they're gonna stretch the rib cage up top a little bit. That's okay. We just don't want it to get all wild and crazy. And you might see some downward stretch as well because the abs are going to be pulling down on the ribs. So we want to see the ribs expand in all directions. But Zach, what's going on with the rib flare? And there's a key difference though when we see ribs flaring versus that multi-directional expansion that I talked about. And the key has to do with a concept called relative motion, or the ability to differentiate joints. In the scenario that I just talked about, where I'm getting bucket handle, pump handle, posterior expansion, slight elevation, slight depression, we are seeing the ribs move apart. There's intersegmental motion. You're seeing the spine move backwards one segment at a time. And we want that. When we have that intersegmental motion, once we have the ability to differentiate joints, that's when we have maximization of movement options. And when we don't have that, we have a reduction of movement options. For example, if I take my left arm, I had to look because I'm looking at myself in the screen and it's all flip-flop, so I'm losing it a little bit. But if I take my left arm and I reach across my body, I'm getting a certain amount of motion in the glenohumeral joint. But what happens, folks, when I run out of that motion? Well, if I keep pulling my arm, all of a sudden the rest of my body is going to start turning. So you're going to see me start to pick up motion in the thorax. Oh, wow, wait, the thorax is going along for the ride. And then if I keep going, well, you can't see it, but my pelvis is also going to start turning that way. Once I run out of motion, once I run out of relative motion at the glenohumeral joint, the body's got to go along for the ride put me in the direction that I'm looking to travel. If you can understand that, you can most definitely understand what's crack-a-lacking when it comes to the rib flaring and why we don't want that. When you see ribs flare outward during a breath of air in, folks, you get a loss of that relative motion. And so what happens is the body starts to move as one unit to create the action that you are demanding of your body. So instead of seeing the rib cage just get bigger in all directions, we see it lock in one place, and your body shoves forward in order to make that action happen. That's different than the expansion that I'm talking about. Your body's locking in place and it's moving into a position to promote the action that you are asking of it. In this case, a breath of air in. We don't want to see the body locking in one place and translating forward in one direction, aka a rib flare. Because the goal that we're talking about in this case, and when we're coaching the stack, aside from talking to Zach, is to maximize the ability to move in multiple directions, to maximize movement options. And when we have a loss of movement options, things lock in place, things move not as one unit as opposed to differentiating units, and then we can't move in all directions, which can have problems. So if we want to stack, what we want is the ability to expand everywhere and compress everywhere, to get bigger and smaller. When you can't do that, things lock into one place, they move as one unit, and you might still be able to go where you want to go, but it's not done so with the ability to differentiate tissues, which could potentially lead to reductions in performance, can be a contributing factor to pain and discomfort. We want to minimize that. So the key, Jim, is we want the ability to have relative motions when we're performing actions during the stack. We don't want things to lock into place. That's what you're seeing with the rib flare, and that's what we don't want. Great question. And folks, I got something even greater, because we talk a lot about stack in my seminar, Human Matrix. And the reason why I'm bringing it up a little bit early, folks, is for you folks who are out on the West Coast, which is the best coast, you want to come to a seminar that I just opened up, which is December 4th and 5th in wonderful Las Vegas, Nevada at the home team. We had a lot of people asking, when's it coming to the West? Are you bringing it to Vegas? Your boy Big Z is, December 4th and 5th. There's also a few others coming up. August 14th and 15th, Ann Arbor, Michigan. September 25th and 26th, Wyckoff, New Jersey, which is right outside of the city. New York, that is. October 23rd and 24th, Philly. November 6th and 7th in Charlotte, North Carolina. And November 20th and 21st in Colorado. That is the full set list for the year. Definitely sign up. Now that I got that out of the way, the next question comes from Sean. This is your question. As a narrow infrasternal angle, I am going to be taking a long, relaxed, exaggerated sigh. Think fogging up the glass window. However, I get to a point where nothing is happening, or I actually feel like my sternum is collapsing inward, causing an almost out-of-breath sensation. Like Take My Breath Away, like that 90s song, but way less cool. Any idea what this might be? We want to be seeing the lower ribs dropping down, correct? Yes. What if upon an exhale they don't move? We got a lot going on here, Sean, but don't worry, your boy Big Z is going to have you taken care of. Sean, by the way, has a great haircut. Let's pack this down a couple things. What should we see first when we complete a full exhale? When you exhale, you want to see everything within the ventral cavity get smaller. You're going to see things coming together like that cool Beatles song. You want internal rotation. If we zoom in to the ab wall and the lower rib cage, you should see the ab wall get smaller in all directions, and you should see the lower rib cage get smaller in all directions. It should move down, back, and in. So in this case, if folks, I have a difficult time making it smaller, you might see some compensatory activity going on, which is the sternum dipping down. And this goes back to what I talked about with Jim's question, relative motion loss. So what's happening with my main man, Sean, is he's exhaling, he's trying to get the air out. He can't for whatever reason. And so then what happens is the thorax locks in as one unit and it tilts anteriorly, which causes that sternum to depress. What this does is it allows rectus, damn near kill this, abdominis to concentrically orient to help my main man Sean get a little bit more air out. But this is undesirable. We don't want that because we've had a loss of relative motion, and also too, it's not going to allow you to maximally get air out of the thorax as well. No bueno. So we don't want the sternum depressing. We want the sternum getting smaller because, folks, when the sternum depresses, the posterior aspect of the thorax expands in like one or two segments, not completely compresses. So if I'm creating expansion posteriorly when it should be getting smaller, well, that's not an exhale. You fail at the exhale. We want to fix that. So if you see the pump handle getting down, the sternum depressing, that's going to negatively impact your ability to create an exhale. Problems ensue, and that's probably why Sean gets that out-of-breath sensation, is because it seals off the exhale too soon. And it probably plays into what he's saying he's not getting, which is the lower rib cage isn't moving. Ideally, when you exhale, if we go back to what the bucket handle is, the bucket handle, we should see the ribs move outward and upward during inhalation, and then as we exhale, we should see it move downward and inward. So if we're not seeing that downward and inward movement, you'll have compensatory activity happen. So it may be that Sean can't get the exhale to be full enough that we get that rib cage to move. Now, folks, sometimes you'll see individuals, they will make the ab wall smaller, which is something that I spend a great deal of time coaching, but they might not be able to generate enough tension in the ab wall to drop the lower rib cage as well. Perhaps they can't kick in the deep abs. This is very common, especially if you're coaching someone with the stack to have a really slow, drawn-out sign. They want the exhale to be very relaxed, and we want the lower abs to get smaller, because a lot of times when you exhale too forcefully, the lower abs will actually get bigger, and that has to go with the sternal depression. So what do you do there? What you can do there to assist in the lower rib cage coming down is add a reach on top of it. This is one time where instead of getting the full exhale, pausing and working on the inhale, that I'll skip the inhale portion. And by skip, I mean skip focusing on the inhale portion, and add something in the mix to get that full exhale to happen. Because think about it, folks. The way that I recommend doing the stack, which is get the tuck first, get a full exhale, keep the ab tension during a pause and an inhale, then reach, is if you're not getting lower rib cage movement, then you're not getting a full exhale. So you need to do something to get a full exhale. A reach is like an icing on the stack cake. Sometimes you got to eat the frosting before you get into the bunch of the cake. Nothing but cakes, get it? So adding a reach, if you're narrow, which would be forward, or if you're wide, which would be 110, 120, that can actually be really useful at helping you get that last little bit of rib cage closure, because it just amplifies the intensity enough that it can bias the abs. And also, too, when you perform those reaches, a narrow reaching forward and a wide reaching at like 110, 120, it helps alter the shape of the rib cage from the top down. Because when I reach forward, I get smushing of the rib cage front side and back side, which allows for lateral expansion. We need that if we're a narrow. And then for a wide, if I reach at that 110, 120, it biases serratus to create a lateral squish to get A to P expansion. So both of those will help alter the shape of the rib cage, but it leads to a trickle-down effect. That can be a great way to get the lower ribs to move. To summarize your great question, Sean, the sternum's collapsing is because you can't get an adequate exhale. We want the ab wall to get smaller and the ribs to drop down, back, and in. If you're not doing that, you got to just make sure you focus on getting that full exhale. And then if the ribs aren't moving, add a reach into the mix. And if you do that, no one will mess with you. Unbelievable question. question. The last scheduled question before I get to you fine folks on the Instagram, baby. This one comes from Jason. And here's what Jason asks. What if the medial borders of the scaps were not flush with the rib cage? Could then a reach at 90 degrees be useful for posterior expansion, rib cage retraction, and getting those medial borders to find their nice, cozy home along the ribs? I'm liking where Jason is going, but what Jason is describing is really tough. So Jason is correct. If I can get the medial border of the scapula away from the thorax, aka scapular internal rotation, well then folks, if I can do that, I can get expansion posteriorly. But when you reach at 90 degrees and you see the medial border flaring off of the rib cage, chances are you're probably not getting legitimate scapular internal rotation. But what oftentimes is happening is the rib cage is throwing itself forward, which is what creates that space. A lot of times if you're doing like a manual technique and you can easily get underneath someone's scapula, the thorax has moved so far forward that you're not really getting the expansion posteriorly that you oh so desire. If you can get a situation like that, in order to see if you're actually getting what you want, you have to check the lower rib cage, because a lot of times when you see the scap flopping way far off of the thorax, chances are the lower rib cage is also way anterior, aka a rib flare, aka you can't stack, aka you can't talk to Zach. And who doesn't want to do that? I'm sure there's a lot of you, but you know, let's go with it, folks. Ideally, you want to see at that 90-degree reach, one, based on the thorax position, and two, based on what's going on with the flexion arc, you ideally want to see the scapula flush against the rib cage. And the reason why I say that is because when you're reaching at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, you're going to have scapular upward rotation and external rotation, and it's going to be out to the side. But folks, what if I told you that you could still get posterior expansion in that particular situation? You can. Because, well, if you think about it, right, at 90 degrees of flexion, if I got the scapula upwardly rotating and externally rotating up against the rib cage, I'm not going to be able to get much air back there. So, wait, Zach, you're saying there's a way you can still bias some posterior expansion at that position? How do I do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The key would be, you guessed it, this is kind of the theme of this particular debrief. I need to create relative motion somewhere to where I can drive some scapular internal rotation without having the scap just falling away from the thorax, or in actuality, the thorax falling forward from the scap. And the key to doing that, you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people, is through the humerus. No joke. If I create humeral external rotation and I don't have the scapula move along with that motion, external rotation of the humerus is also internal rotation of the scapula, which is, if I have internal rotation of the scapula, I have an eccentric orientation of muscles on the posterior aspect of the thorax, which means you can get air into the upper back. And the muscles that will pull the scaps into internal rotation are going to be your posterior cuff muscles. Because think about this, folks. We think of the cuff as an external rotator of the humerus, which is going to allow that to tip backwards. If I fix the humerus and I contract the rotator cuff muscles and it pulls the proximal attachments towards the distal, you're going to have scapular internal rotation. which will allow for more air into the upper back. So if you can create that motion anywhere, anytime, you're going to get posterior expansion. So how do I do that? This, folks, is why activities like arm bars with screwdrivers are immensely useful. When you're performing an arm bar at 90 degrees, want to tell that reach, please. If I turn my arm and I don't move my scapula or arch my back or anything like that, on that inhale, when I turn my arm in that position, that's creating a relative scapular internal rotation, which is promoting posterior expansion in the posterior thorax. That is so cool. So instead of allowing your scapula to just fall way away from your rib cage, just drive relative humeral motion with the scapula flush, because you're going to get what you're looking for, which is the scapula is going to internally rotate, you're going to get air into the upper back, and life will be good. So that is preferred over letting the scaps not be flush against the rib cage, and the reason why that is because if the scaps are not flush against the rib cage at that particular reach, then chances are you're probably not going to get posterior expansion, because scaps aren't flush, the thorax is likely way in front of the scapula, which is indicative of a loss of relative motion. Jason, unbelievable question. All right, the Fitness Grail has a question on the prone position, using that for a stack. I find it uncomfortable in the prone rib cage stack, particularly the SI joint lumbar area. Any tips? Also, when in prone positions, what part of the upper back or points of contact with the ground? Well, if we're talking about prone, I'm assuming you're talking about facing down, so your upper back wouldn't contact the ground. But here's the issue with prone, is if you're lying completely flat and you have all of this forward positioning, meaning your thorax is forward, maybe you have a deep lumbar lordosis, you might have a hard time reversing that position, because think about it, folks. If I'm lying on my stomach, gravity is pushing downward, so that's going to bias more anterior expansion. Well, if you're already sitting way anterior, that could potentially be more uncomfortable. So what you can do, and there's a video that I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/troubleshooting-the-stack. If you're running into that, then what you might have to do is you might have to bias yourself out of that anteriorly expanded position. But in this video, I talk with my boy Isaac about making his prone hamstring curl mo better. And all we did was we put a couple pads underneath his stomach, and then he was able to get a lot more hamstring tension and a lot more comfort. So too with prone, if you put something underneath the stomach, then chances are that's going to make you get way more out of prone. And actually, prone can be a really useful position to teach the stack, because you can almost passively put someone into a position where they can bias that lower rib cage the way we need it. Also, a great position to teach someone in would be lying over a Swiss ball in the prone position. That can also be really useful because it pushes the thorax posteriorly and allows you to get more posterior expansion. If you're getting discomfort in the supine position, then what you may have is, if you are sitting so far forward, gravity may not be able to push you so far down to allow for posterior expansion. So this could be someone who has a deep arch in their back when they're lying flat. What you could do is you could put something underneath the sacrum. This could be a pad, this could be a pillow. I've used a towel roll to help passively tip you posteriorly. I would try that, because that might help reduce the discomfort in the SI area. And then following up with that, what part of the upper back or points of contact with the ground in that particular position? It's going to depend on the reach, but I would want as much of the upper back flat as possible. What you don't want is someone whose head's way forward and then it has to tip back to contact the ground. So if you run into that particular situation, just put a pillow or two underneath their head and they ought to be in business. Good question. My man Dan When working with wides that are deconditioned older, are you okay giving them side planks right away? I worry about the shoulder. So a side plank can be useful for creating that lateral compression for a wide ISA, which is necessary for the stack. But if you have someone who's deconditioned, I will echo Dan. No, I don't typically give someone a side plank because they just might not be able to generate enough force. The force is not strong with them to get into position. So what you could do is, instead of lifting up, you could have them get into the sideline position and just push themselves away. Or you can do it with a flat hand. Both of those are useful. Or you know what, Dan? You could also do is I have them lie sideline over a Swiss ball to create lateral compression. That works great. There's an exercise that I utilize that I've given that to someone. Or if they don't have a Swiss ball at home, just have them put a bunch of pillows on their side. You're still going to get the lateral compression because you take advantage of the sideline position, and the pillow will help reinforce that further. So I would give that a shot if you got someone who's a little bit more deconditioned and you want to use sideline. MateJSulk.cz. Neutral pelvis stack versus posterior tilt stack. Which, when? Well, we can't necessarily say if we have a neutral position versus a posterior tilt, because, I mean, there is necessarily no such thing as neutral because we are moving throughout. But most individuals, when you're dealing with compensatory strategies, they're going to be sitting way anterior. So what you want to do is you want to get them to tuck their hips somewhat posteriorly. But what I don't want, and I did a full debrief on this, don't worry, it'll be in the show notes, where I get a situation where I posteriorly tilt to such a degree that the lumbar spine goes along for the ride. So if you see the pelvis go way forward, and perhaps they got a bulge at one particular segment of the lumbar spine, we don't want that. So the tuck is subtle. What you want is you want a slight posterior tilt. They should perceive, depending on the position that you use, distal glute proximal hamstring, and you shouldn't have much ab tension when you're coaching that. If you get that, that's enough. That's going to allow the pelvis to get into position to promote the dynamic movement that we should see in the viscera during a breath cycle. The visceral movement that happens with inhalation and exhalation is what's going to restore the relative motion that we should see at the SI joint, namely counternutation and nutation. So we want just enough that the client perceives glutes and hamstrings working. And if they don't have the interoception to perceive that, you can even have them palpate those areas to see if those are kicking in. You just want that, and then you're going to coach the breathing as we've talked about in previous debriefs. Hopefully that clarifies. IOK_rehab. Hey Zach, what kind of cues would you use for an exhale for someone who keeps turning on their rectus, damn near kildis, abdominis? I love this question. Rectus damn near kildis abdominis can be a big issue for people when they're trying to get the stack. And the reason why it kicks in is because they're trying to generate too much tension to complete that full exhalation. So it's a superficial strategy to make that happen, which we do not want. We don't want that to happen. So the big key, there's a few different ways that you can help with this. The first would be to make sure the exhale is super duper slow. The cue that I use for my supreme clientele is I want your exhale to be 15 seconds long, and that's regardless of if it's wide or narrow. I want it to be really long, slow, and drawn out. I will superimpose on that a manual cue, them using their hands, of putting their hands right below their belly button, and I'll make them aware that I want that area to drop down as they exhale. Not suck in, but it should get smaller. When you got someone who's over-rectusifying the exhale, which is the technical term, that area will pooch out. So sometimes just getting them awareness of what they're doing can really help mitigate the rectus damn near kildis. That would be one thing. The other thing that you can focus on is driving a slight amount of OA extension. When you drive OA extension, what that does is it will depress the hyoid bone. When the hyoid bone depresses, it concentrically orients the infrahyoid muscles which attach to the sternum. That will help give you a little bit of leverage to keep the sternum up while the rectus abdominis tries to pull the sternum down. So you're thinking, Zach, come on, these muscles are really tiny. But it has to do with just orientation and position. Folks, I also think we can look at musculature, but it also helps open up the upper airway as well, because when I lock things down and I lose relative motion between the neck, the sternum, and all that, that's when I get that anterior thorax tilt and rectus gets biased. So anything I can do that differentiates those movements is going to be really helpful. So doing the chin away from the neck, the CPR position, can be really great as well. Those two things can help de-rectusify your exhale quite a bit. The other thing that I would say would be making sure you choose good positions for your supreme clientele where they're not getting that. With wide infrasternal angle people, sometimes starting them in the supine position can make it really tough for them to create the exhale that you oh so desire. And the reason why is because the supine position, according to an article by Takashima et al., increases the lateral dimensions of the rib cage, which a wide already has big lateral dimensions. Putting them in side lying instead can squish the lateral dimensions, which creates A to P expansion, which de-rectifies the exhale. So that would be another useful strategy. For a narrow infrasternal angle person, that person could potentially do better with supine, but then use the cues that I'd mentioned. So hopefully that helps you minimize rectus abdominis activity and get the exhale that we need. Awesome question. Isaac, again, how do you ensure you have a stack during rotation? The big things would be making sure they get a full exhale, and when you're rotating, a lot of times you're initiating a reach, so if you can keep the chest parallel as you reach and not induce a bend at the sternum, that usually mitigates losing the stack during rotation. So I want to have that turn happen without bends occurring. Because when you bend forwards or you bend backwards, both of those will steal your ability to rotate. Now that doesn't mean that we're like this stiff human being and it's like, okay, I'm going to lock in place and minimize movement. No, you want to be able to flow and reach as far as you can without having the thorax orient as one. That's the key difference. The fitness grail, if trying to perform the stack on a tall plank, so push up, start position, the scaps flare, and it's hard to get them flush on the rib cage even when they exhale. So what you're seeing here, if you are seeing the scaps fly away from the rib cage during any type of plank, that's because they can't establish lower rib cage position and the thorax is falling way forward. So chances are that activity is probably too challenging for them to create the shape change that we need during that particular activity. So your solution would be to make it easier somehow. So if we use some type of front plank as an example, that could be elevating, making it higher. Just like if a person couldn't do a push-up from the floor, you put them on an inclined surface. Do the same thing with a front plank. That can work quite well. Sometimes if you're doing like a straight arm plank or a push-up, putting an elevation of the heel of the hand can also make it easier. But if you've tried those things and it's still tough, I would choose a different position. You might look at doing a supine reach or a standing reach, and that might be able to get you the same adaptation. Camilla, I have a client who uses erectors to complete the exhale. Any tips? Okay, so if you get someone who's exhaling and they're throwing the rib cage forward, which is going to bias the erectors, you need to choose a position that eccentrically orients the erectors. So this could be prone position, putting something underneath their stomach so they're in a little bit of posterior orientation. You could also put someone over a Swiss ball. That would probably be the biggest thing that I would consider doing. You might also consider putting them in the side lying position. And again, you could drape them over their sides, because if I'm in the side lying position, especially if they're a wide ISA, that will allow for A to P expansion passively. So those would be the two things that I would try, Camilla. Isaac, any suggestions for someone hyper-tucking the pelvis forward to try and get the stack? Yes. A big cue that I use, and there's a whole debrief where I talk about this. It'll be linked in the show notes, which again are on zachcouples.com/troubleshooting-the Untitled-Stack. But if you got someone who's an over-tucker, a cue that I use that's really useful is you want them to differentiate lumbar spine from pelvis. So what I will have someone do is I have them actually arch their back. So I'll tell them, arch your back like a Jennifer Lopez or Kim Kardashian, whoever you prefer. I prefer J-Lo because I had a crush on her for a very long time, still do to some extent. But I'll have them arch their back like they're J-Lo, and then I want them to un-J-Lo themselves. And you want it to be subtle, slow, easy, and effortless. If you do the manual palpation of the ab wall, so have them touch their lower abs, ideally that should stay chill as they're doing this tuck. So you have them arch, unarch, making sure the abs stay relaxed, and then just have them note, are you feeling glutes? Are you feeling hamstrings? If you got that, that will minimize the over-tucking. So try that out. Give it a shot. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. We've been going about 45 minutes. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I love the questions. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you having as a fam. It's good to be back. I know I've been gone for the last couple of weeks with travel and things like that. I'm going to be here for a hot minute, and my hope is, folks, too, I'm going to try to bring some stuff on the road so I can continue these going. But thanks. You all are awesome. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.